Hey YouTube, it's your girl Dr. J, and I thought I would come and do a quick video on, and this is video number 3 on Let's Talk Gifted. And in this video, I'm going to focus on an area of giftedness that doesn't get a lot of discussion, but it is something that is a big issue in our household and in the household of a lot of families with gifted children that I know, and that is gifted children that also have learning disabilities and other disorders. This is something that's extremely common, but it's actually not really known and recognized outside of the gifted community. And first, I am not a licensed clinical psychologist. I do not play one on television. I do not play one on movies, and I do not play one on YouTube. So I am only going to talk about those specific areas that we have personal experience with in our household. So I'm only going to talk about our areas. And those areas are areas that are very common amongst gifted children, but it is in no way all encompassing, and this is just our experience. First, the standard term that's used by psychologists and the education community when it comes to gifted children with disabilities is twice exceptional, or 2E. And that means that a child is clinically classified as gifted, which means they have an IQ score that's 2 standard deviations above normal, or 2 standard deviations at least above 100. And they also have a clinical diagnosis of another disorder. In our household, there are 3 issues that we deal with. 2 of those issues affect all 3 of my children, and one of those issues affects just one of my children. So I'm going to start with the issues that affect all 3 of my children. The first is dyslexia. I've talked about dyslexia quite a bit on my videos. So most people who have been following my channel, you guys know that all 3 of my kids are dyslexic. Now, what's not actually known is that their classification of dyslexia is one that is a little kind of new, kind of not known as broadly, and that's stealth dyslexia. And that basically means that my kids, usually when children are diagnosed with dyslexia, it's diagnosed based off of an inability to read. And usually it's when children are reading significantly below grade level. Well, with gifted children, dyslexia is often masked because they don't actually read necessarily significantly below grade level, and sometimes they don't read below grade level at all. For instance, when Speedster was diagnosed with dyslexia, he was diagnosed when he was in a private kindergarten, and the school did not diagnose him. We actually took him on our own to a psychologist that specialized in working with gifted children, because the school, we were saying, okay, we're seeing some things with the way he's reading. I'm a little bit concerned. And the school was like, oh, no. He's the best reader in the class. There's no way he's having issues. And we're like, no, something's not right. Well, when he was diagnosed, he was actually reading a little bit above grade level at the time, because he was only in kindergarten. But she was seeing the classic signs of dyslexia. So even though he would not be eligible for a traditional dyslexia diagnosis, we were, told, okay, yes, he's dyslexic. And so what he was classified with is stealth dyslexia. And that is dyslexia that's found in gifted children, because gifted children tend to be able to compensate enough to be able to read enough, to be able to spell enough, so that they're not diagnosed with dyslexia. It's just that people go, oh, my child can read, but they're just reading slow. Or, oh, my child can spell a little bit, but they kind of struggle in spelling. But when you have a gifted child, you're looking and you see other families of gifted children, and they'll say, well, my child was reading at 3, or my child was reading at 4. And you're looking, and your child is, maybe 5 or 6. And you know that they're gifted, or they seem to be gifted in these other areas, but they're not reading. And actually, the way that stealth dyslexia is diagnosed is that they look at a child's IQ score, and they say, for a child with this IQ, this is where they should be working. And then they look at their math scores, and then they say, okay, a child with this proficiency in math coupled with this IQ, they should be reading at this level. And if they're reading 2 standard deviations and spelling 2 standard deviations below, at least below where they should be, what they should be doing based on all these other factors, that's how they get their dyslexia diagnosis. Because generally, gifted children can compensate in early reading, and it's not until they get to around that 3rd grade level that the severity of the problem begins to manifest. And for us, thankfully, we were working with a really good psychologist who was able to kind of let us know, okay, this child is starting to show signs of dyslexia, because it did kind of really manifest itself in the 3rd grade, but we were already working on it, and so we were able to kind of pull things in, and now Speedster is able to read at grade level, even though he still spells below grade level. And so we're still working on reading, we're still working on spelling, but we also pull in accommodation, which means that we use audiobooks and other things like that, because he's dyslexic, so he's never going to read with ease. He's never going to spell with ease. And so we wanted to make sure that reading didn't pull down all the other things. And with the Wonder Twins, it was the same thing. Their reading scores, I mean, it's just like they just weren't getting it. They were having like what seemed like auditory issues. And that's one of the things that's really hard. And a lot of people who may have children who are gifted, but they also have a learning disability, they struggle because they say, well, how can I tell people that my child is gifted and they're having trouble reading? Or how can I tell people my child is gifted and they're having trouble in math? But like I talked about in part 1, giftedness, it's not the same as being smart. I did a video when I first started my channel called Batman versus Superman, or Bright versus Gifted, so that people can see. A lot of times people look at bright children and they go, those children are gifted. And they wouldn't have a diagnosis of giftedness. They'd have a diagnosis of they're smart, they're bright, they get book knowledge. But giftedness is the way that the brain processes information. And so a child can have a brain that processes information in a particular type of way, but they can still have a learning disability on top of that. And you have to really be able to look at that learning disability, because sometimes that learning disability will mask the giftedness, and sometimes the giftedness will mask the learning disability. And that's why it's important to be able to tease those things out, because, you know, you can begin to wonder, like, is this child really gifted? Because, you know, how can they tell me that, you know, this child has a, 160 IQ and we're having trouble, like spelling fish, and, and so, to understand that and be able to tease those things out is really important. So, that's why we, have the resources that we do. That's why I talk about reading a lot. That's why I talk about dyslexia a lot, because I want people to know that you can have a child that is intellectually gifted and they still have a disability that needs to be addressed in your homeschooling. So that's one that we deal with. Another that we deal with is one that I also did a video on early in my channel. It's called sensory processing, or kryptonite for gifted children. And sensory processing disorder is basically where you take in so much from your senses that it becomes overwhelming. And this is one that a lot of gifted children struggle with. And this is the one where people first begin to see something that's different with their kids when they're really, really young. And that's where I talked about like the tags and the socks and the jeans. And that tends to be the physical aspects of sensory processing disorder, where your child will really struggle with, they can't have tags on their clothes. And a lot of people go, okay, what's the big deal with tags? But they actually hurt the child. Socks, the seam of their socks will physically hurt them. Jeans will physically hurt. And the reason is because they feel them so much, because their senses are so heightened. Especially in younger gifted children, the senses are so heightened. They take in so much information from their senses that it starts to get overwhelming. I know with Faster Fox, we actually thought that she had hearing loss, because there would be times when we would call her name and she wouldn't respond, or there would be situations where we would say something and she would misunderstand what we were saying. So we would have her hearing tested over and over again, and people would say, oh no, she's hearing fine. Well, when we had taken her for some more intensive testing for her hearing, it wasn't that she had a hearing problem. She actually had extremely, extremely sensitive hearing, where even with all three kids, when they ended up testing all three kids, they found out all three kids could hear as high as the test could measure, which means they were probably hearing beyond what the test could measure. So think about that. They could hear as high as the test could measure for a human. My kids could hear at that level. And so when you can hear things other people can't necessarily hear, they start to think that you're a little bit wacky, because you're like, what's with that dog barking? And nobody else can hear the dog because you're hearing a dog bark that's like 2 blocks away, and nobody else hears the dog. And so you're going, that dog is getting on my nerves. And people are like, did you hear that crazy kid talking about a dog barking? What? And so what they would do is they would actually physically cut off their own hearing because it was getting overwhelming. Other people wouldn't hear it. People would say that they weren't really hearing what they were saying they were hearing. And so Faster Fox actually was starting to shut down her senses because they were becoming overwhelming. And so we really had to work with that, and that's why we had to come into the homeschool environment. That's one of the reasons why we needed to come into the homeschool environment, so I could control things a little bit better so they wouldn't get overwhelmed by what the world was sending out. I mean, sight, had trouble with sight, where they had really affected their ability to see their periphery vision, because they ended up with very, very, very small periphery vision. And it was thought that they did that because they were taking in so much through their eyes that their brain, just because it was getting overburdened with processing what it was seeing, was just starting to lessen that periphery vision. And so we had to do a year of vision therapy, and we're still we stopped the therapy, but we're still kind of struggling, and we still kind of deal with those areas because they could have made themselves blind basically by continuing to bring in that periphery vision just to not be overwhelmed by what they were seeing. Smell can be overwhelming, where people will get offended because the child, when they're 2 or 3, they'll just say, you stink, where it's not so much that they're not trying to be mean, but it's just that, imagine if you can smell everything in just a really, really heightened way. And so what you smell is really intense. So somebody thinks that they just dabbed on perfume, but what you smell is, if it smells like they poured the whole bottle all over their body, or somebody is cooking fish or cabbage or something in the kitchen, and it might be a little smell to them, but to you it's like they just dropped you in a vat of hot dog juice, and you're swimming through it. And so they're having all these issues with the world coming at them in all these different ways, and it just gets so overwhelming that a lot of times these kids will shut down, or they have meltdowns. And a meltdown, you basically, if you know anything like nuclear reactors, what happens with what is a nuclear reactor meltdown? It is where so much pressure got built up that the thing just shuts down completely, and then all the safety valves come off, and then stuff starts flying and exploding. Those are the meltdowns that children with sensory processing have. It's basically that so much information has come at them from their senses, their brain and their body can no longer handle it, and everything just, the pressure builds and everything just explodes. And it's really hard when you're in a household because you don't necessarily, how if you work at a nuclear reactor factory, at least there are these pressure dials that let you know when the meltdown is coming. But sometimes as a parent, you don't see when the overwhelmingness is starting. And then all of a sudden you say something like, go get your shoes. And then it's like, it is like something just exploded in the atmosphere, and you're on, really, you just had this complete breakdown with, temper tantrum and screaming and crying, and all I did was ask you to get your shoes. But it's not that you just asked them to get their shoes, it's that everything, that was just one more thing that they couldn't process another piece of information. that there's not one more thing that they can process because they were just barely making it through the day. And then all of a sudden more got added on them that they had to wade through and decipher through. And that's where that struggle comes in, and that's where those meltdowns come in. And what happens is when they're 2 and 3, it looks like that traditional temper tantrum. But then people will tell you, oh, your child is going to grow out of temper tantrums when they're 2 or when they're 3, or they do ha ha he, look at that child having a temper tantrum. But sensory processing, your child gets better at managing it, but that generally takes years and years for your child to be able to completely manage on their own. And so your child is still this nuclear reactor that's waiting to explode, and they're 6 or they're 7. And so what happens is you have to really, a lot of times parents of gifted children, they really manage the environment. And sometimes people think that, oh, you say your child, if they know that you classify your child as gifted, they'll say, oh, you guys are being arrogant, you can't hang out with people. And sometimes even if you don't classify your child as gifted, or if you just know that your child has triggers and things like that, you will just keep them away from certain things like birthday parties. Like, you go, okay, we can't go to Chuck E. Cheese and have a birthday party, or we can't go here or there, because you know that when you go to really loud, really bright places where there's going to be a lot of stuff going on, you know that those are things that can cause your 7-year-old to have a meltdown that people would typically attribute to a 3-year-old. And so people are looking at you and they're going, I don't care if her child can read when they were 4, they don't need to be acting like that, And so, and you now that your child is 6 or 7, you understand what's going on, but you also know that everybody else doesn't understand what's going on. Everybody else doesn't understand that your child heard sounds that nobody else heard. Your child was smelling smells nobody else heard. Your child was feeling their socks and feeling their jeans and feeling their tags and feeling all this other kind of stuff. Like every single one of your child's senses was just overwhelmed, and all of a sudden a kid just stepped on their foot. So they were holding it all together at the library. They were holding it together, that they had to try to tune out 17 different conversations that was going on at story time. They held it together when somebody was they decided to have a light show at the library for story time, and somebody was flashing lights and all this other kind of stuff. They were still holding it together. They were holding it together that the only pair of socks that were available for them to wear this morning had seams. They were holding it together that the only pair of pants that were available for them to wear today was jeans. But the trigger was that kid that stepped on their foot, and everybody else is thinking, I know that didn't hurt that bad. But when you feel at a deeper level that other people feel, what may not have hurt them, it did hurt you. And so your child goes into absolute explosion, and then everybody's looking at the child, and then they're looking at you going, you need to handle that, because your kid is being a brat, or your kid is just spoiled, or they're too old to be acting like that. And so it can be overwhelming because you feel like you're in this world all by yourself. Nobody understands what you're going through. And then if there's emotional intensity on top of that, that tends to be the one that's the scariest to process, because emotional intensity is where, your child, a kid says something to them, and, they're, not only that they're not, it wasn't just that they hurt their feelings, but they're like, oh, I want to go and hide. Nobody cares about me. Nobody wants to be around me. Nobody likes me. I should just go away. I should just go live in a cave. You don't want me. Nobody loves me. And so you realize that, people are saying, that kid, they're just being a brat. But you realize, no, they're not being a brat. They're really processing these really deep thoughts. They're really handling these very big emotions, the emotions and self-doubt and trying to figure out who you are in life, and trying to figure out what you are, and are you loved, and are you cared for, and do people want to be around you, and are you a likable person? All these things that kids normally kind of go through in adolescence. So you're expecting your child to go through these things when they're 12 or 13 or 14 years old. All of a sudden, your child's 8. your child's 9 and they're dealing with self-doubt issues that you were expecting to have when they were 13, or they're dealing with emotional breakdowns over things that's normally something that you would sit down with your teenager and be able to process and talk about life choices and how people act and how to make friends and how to do all this, and you were preparing to have this sort of conversation with a child that was 13, and you're sitting there having to have this conversation with a child that's 6 or 7 or 8. And so that's one of the big issues that one of those big disabilities, that sensory processing, that overexcitability, that intensity, that people who don't tend to have gifted children, they don't understand. And you end up keeping it inside, and you end up keeping it bottled in because people think you're making it up, or you're making excuses for this child, or you're not being a good parent, or that child isn't maturing and growing. And maybe if you cared less about how smart they were and cared more about their behavior, they wouldn't act like that. And you sit up there like, that's what we do all day, is me helping them cope with this world, so don't even start. So you end up kind of going into your own little shell and stuff like that. So that's a big one that we deal with. And so I'm here, like, if y'all are dealing with it too, we can form a little support group. We can help each other. We can send each other 911 text messages where we're like, help me, girl. Because it is tough to go through those moments and to always be heightened, because you don't know when the next emotional roller coaster is gonna fall down on your head. And especially when you have multiple children, when you're like, please don't let more than one have a meltdown at a time. Like, this is your day. You get today. You gotta wait and hold it together till tomorrow. So that's another one. And the one that's the biggest struggle for me, because I only have one child that deals with this, but this is the issue that hurts my heart the most, because it has the deepest impact on my child, and that is slow processing speed. And I only have one child. Salamander deals with slow processing speed, which is interesting because he chose the name Salamander, and it actually really, really fits him. But slow processing speed is basically where it takes your child much longer than the average person to respond to questions, to do things, to get at answers. For instance, Salamander is my child who has the lowest IQ score. So even though his IQ score is in the gifted range, he has the lowest IQ score. But honestly, I actually think that he's probably my most gifted child. The reason is because the psychologist, she had talked with us, and she was saying that, like, how a lot of the IQ tests is put together this puzzle, or, do this and do that, where they're trying to see how does your brain work. They're timed. And what she had explained to us is that Salamander never got a puzzle wrong. Okay. It was just that he did not complete the things in the time allotted. And so she let him go ahead and finish, but he didn't get any points for it. And so that brought his score down quite a bit. Now, people go, well, what does that matter for test taking? But that it's not just test taking. And this is one of the things that I struggle with, because so many people assume that Salamander's not smart. And I will give you a prime example. He's little, right? Let's say he's 4 years old. Somebody says, hey, what's your name? Now, that seems like a simple question. You ask a 4-year-old their name, they say John, Sally, Sue, whatever. Salamander would not answer, because in Salamander's mind, he's thinking, do they want my full name? Do they just want my first and last name? Do I only tell them my first name? Should I tell them my nickname? Is this person a stranger? Because I know I'm not supposed to actually be talking to strangers. Now, I know this person was talking to my mom, but I don't really know this person, and my mom didn't really say that I could talk to this person. So, this person they're just the cashier at the checkout counter, or they're just the usher, or they're just, and so he's processing all these kinds of things. And By the time he's ready to answer, he's decided that, yes, it's okay to tell this person my name. I'm only going to tell them my first name. And, so by the time he's ready, they've moved on. And they're thinking, that kid's 4 years old and he doesn't even know his name. That wasn't a hard question. And then so they're thinking he's mute. Or, and then they're also comparing him to, he has a twin. And Faster Fox is her name. And she chose her name and it fits her fine. Because she is quick, speedster, quick, witty, quirky, come out fast. So you ask Faster Fox her name, and she's like, Faster Fox. And then you ask Salamander, and he's like, now, you don't know what he's thinking, because he's just looking at you. He's thinking, he's asking himself all these questions, but what you see is, see that? See, y'all were thinking like, what's she gonna say? Okay, so so when it takes you 10 seconds to answer a question, or 15 seconds, or 30 seconds to answer a question that somebody else answered in 0.5 seconds, people start thinking you're not bright. Okay, they wouldn't even stick around for the answer. They moved on. So now they're treating him like, not even that he's just not smart, but he's slow intellectually, mentally retarded. And then he has his twin, and everybody's treating her like she's the smartest thing that ever hit the planet, because she's speedy, she's fast, she can give you the answer quick. Okay. Even though she may not have thought as intently about the question. Like, my husband and I, we laugh because I tell people in a minute, when my kids are adults, if anybody has to make an end-of-life decision for me, it's going to be Salamander. Because Speedster is logical. Quick and logical. He'll say, okay, if she has more than a 50% chance of survival, I will not pull the plug. Doctor may come in and say she has a 49.9% chance of survival. He'll say, pull the plug. Not because he's morbid, not because he wants me done away with, but because he'll say, we agree that if the survival rate was 50% or more, we would not pull the plug. You just said the survival rate was 49.5%. That's less than 50%. We're going to pull the plug. And they were like, well, what about rounding? Well, you're supposed to be a doctor. Doctor, you're not supposed to round. And I'm glad that he's logical like that, because you know what? I wouldn't want my medical doctor rounding stuff for me. I wouldn't want my surgeon rounding. So I get that he's logical, and that's great. But I don't necessarily want people thinking completely logically for end-of-life decisions. Faster Fox, she's my emotional girl, where she's like, oh no, I'll take care of my mom. She'll be my road dog. So, I'd be like in a vegetative state, and she'd be taking me to Disney World, like dressing me up, and, people be like, okay, the body is starting to atrophy, and she'd be like, no, it's cool, I'll take care of her, we cool, we Thelma and Louise, we doing our thing, so she would like, have me hooked up to machines and be waiting for, cryogenics to freeze and unfreeze me, and, so I don't want that, but Salamander, he would say, okay, let me go research, let me get all the information, let me really think about this, let me get a second opinion, and I'll come back, we'll meet again in a couple of days when I've had time to think. So I love that he takes time to think. The problem is, our society is not set up to give people that time to think. Our curriculums are not set up to give people time to think. Okay, when you give a child with slow processing speed a piece of paper with 15 questions, 15 math questions, they're just like, oh my gosh, because it's going to take all day. Because they're sitting there, and like I talked about yesterday, where, it'll say 7 minus 8, and then you'll say, okay, you can't take 7 from 8. And they're like, yes, you can, it's -1. Like, every time he's looking at a math problem, he has to shut off all the other options that his brain, because he's so smart, because his brain works so well and makes all these connections, he has to take the time to shut off all the wrong connections first. And so even though the problem appears simple, because his brain works in such a complex way, it takes him 2, 3, 4 times as long to answer this question. Not because he's slow, not because he's not smart, not because he's not bright, but because he is. And so his disability is his ability to think in so many different ways, to solve a problem so many different ways. And now when you have one way to solve a problem, you solve that problem fast. Even if you don't solve it right, you're solving it fast. But if you look at a problem and you can immediately think of 100 ways to solve that problem, now you gotta try to choose the best way. And so even if I'll show you guys Salamander's curriculum, and like when y'all see his curriculum, I go, he's in 2nd grade and you're doing phonics again. Yes, I'm doing it again for one reason and one reason only, and that's just to get him faster. And it hurts my heart that I have to intentionally shut down some of his creativity, some of his problem solving, some of his thinking outside the box, because he can't function this slow. Society won't let him function this slow. And so I have to intentionally force him to, when you see, FAT, you don't automatically think A can say A can say A can say A. No, I don't want you to think about it. I just want you to say fat. That's it. Yeah. And because right now, when he reads extremely slow. Not because he doesn't know phonics, but because he goes through every phonic option available. And then only after he's tested all the phonetic ways which a word can be said, will he choose the word that, okay, fat. Because fate doesn't make sense, and odd is not a real word. And so you can't do that for every single word on a page. And so I have to stop some of those really, really good connections. You can get you some breakfast. Okay, thanks. I have to stop some of that creativity, some of those really, really good thought processes, just because we live in a world where speed reigns. And I would be doing my child a disservice if I let him continue to function in this way. And I will show you, I'll give you guys a great example of why I have to get them faster in certain areas. And why this is why we have a maker lab. This is why I have engineering as a part of our homeschool. This is why the Ultimate Book of Building is a part of our homeschool curriculum. This is why I made an engineering area. Is because I have to shut down that creativity in one area, I had to open it up in another area. For instance, with Salamander, I still remember the twins. They were probably 5 years old, and they were playing with blocks, just the little wooden blocks. And so, I said, I'm going to build a house. So, Faster Fox, she builds a house, 10 minutes, looks like a house, well, it's a house. 10 minutes in, Salamander got 4 blocks up. You're like, all right, maybe he can't do it. All right. 20 minutes later, okay, he has a little structure. 40 minutes later. Now this is very young child playing with these wooden blocks. 40 minutes later. Wow, that's looking cool. An hour and a half later, he calls me and my husband back into his room. Here's my house. Then he starts to explain it. With a wooden house, he had a sloped ceiling. He said those are the solar panels. And then he turned on a lamp. He had positioned the house in such a way that the lamp was acting as the sun that would shine on the solar panels. And then he had another block. This is the battery pack. So the sun shines on the solar panels. The energy from the solar panels goes into this battery pack so the house can be lit at night. And here's the tornado detector siren, because we had gone through F5 tornadoes and he figured that every house should have a tornado detection system. So when he started thinking, every single block that he put down had a reason and a purpose behind it. And if I would have said after 10 minutes, after Faster Fox finished her house, if I'd have said, okay, block time over, he never would have gotten to finish it. And I would have been thinking, he can't make a house. This child can't even put together a house. If I would have stopped him at 20 minutes, I'd be like, oh, look, it took him 4 times as long, but he got a house and she got a house. Okay. But the fact that I had built in time where he could just go and do his thing and show his greatness, he was able to show us just how that brain was working. And it's amazing. And we get amazed with Salamander all the time. I had just shown my husband, let me see. Okay, his book, Salamander's book is right here. So I told you guys we're, redoing phonics again just to get them faster. So I read him a story, because part of this book I read a story about a letter, and then, he dictates what the story was about. Okay, so people had said, oh, reading comprehension, because can't write fast. But then when he would dictate the story back, okay, he's 6 years old, he could dictate. I made there be a break. So it wasn't like I read him the story and then he immediately dictated the story back to me. I read him the story, time passed, we did other stuff. I said, okay, now I'm ready to write, dictate. He was talking, he gave me the entire story back. Line by line. Processed it, like he gets it. It's not that he doesn't get it, he gets it. But he needs time to be able to cut off the connections that don't work. The other issue is with a child like this who makes a lot of connections, he struggles a lot with, like, for instance, math. Math is a big struggle for him. Not because he's not good at math. And not just because he has a lot of connections, but when you think of electrical engineering, and anybody, my husband's an electrical engineer, so I think about circuits and stuff like that. Think about Christmas lights. Okay. You guys know that when you have a string of Christmas lights, if one string is out, if one light is out, the string won't work. Now, what you do is you see this tangled mess of web of lights, and you got to go and you got to test every single light to figure out which light doesn't work. Well, that's what happens with Salamander, is because he makes all these different connections. If he makes a wrong connection, okay, so let's say he understood something. Let's say he heard something, but he heard it wrong, or he understood it wrong. Well, it's not easy to fix. It's not an easy fix at all, because he's made so many connections. You got to test every single connection that he made to try to figure out, in this web of 100 possibilities, one strand in this web of 100 possibilities is wrong. So I have to sit down with this child, and we have to go through all 100 options until we figure out which one is a wrong connection for him. Because if I leave that wrong connection there, it's going to continue to affect this and that and the other. And so then all of a sudden, it's chaos. It's chaos for him, because he's going down a path that's not working. And just like them Christmas lights, the whole bulb, the whole string is dim, because one light is broken. And when people look at him, all they see, light don't work, dead light don't work, broken, messed up. They don't see that in this string of 100 lights, 99 work. Whereas for most people, they might have a string of 10 lights and all 10 work. They may have 25 lights and all 25 work. They may have 50 lights and all 50 work. No, he gets no credit. No credit at all for the fact that he got 99 lights working. All people see is, don't work, one's missing. He's slow. He behind. Got a loopy. His siblings are fast. They're bright. They're witty. They got it. They're amazing. Him, He's slow. So, y'all, it's hard. And I love the psychologist that we work with, because she sat us down. She sat my husband and I down, and it was amazing. I was glad she was honest, but she looked at me one year, and she said, I need for you to be happy at home, because you cannot put these kids. I'll cook you some. You cannot put these kids in a traditional school environment. They will not be understood. They will be mistreated. They will not be able to reach their full potential, and especially Salamander. He will not be understood. He has to be with someone who's going to be as patient as he needs. He needs to be with somebody who's going to remind him that he's great. He needs to be with somebody who's going to not judge him based on what he does at 5 minutes, or, you know, he's running a marathon, and the traditional school system has everybody sprinting, you know, and so it doesn't matter that he runs a marathon faster than most people in the world. They're judging you by where you're at the 100-meter mark. Okay, and so Speedster and Faster Fox at the 100-meter mark, they're in front of everybody else. Well, they fast. Whereas Salamander, at the 100-meter mark, he's last. But in a marathon, he's first. Okay. But we don't value that. I mean, you can see that. I mean, you can see, you know, even in marathons today. You know, how many times do Americans win marathons? Ever. We don't want to do fast. We don't want to do long. We don't want to endure. We don't want to take it all the way out there. No, fast, quick results. And I have a child who's a marathon runner, and I have to get that child ready to sprint, and that's not easy, and it's painful. I mean, think like my kids run. My husband is a great runner, so sometimes we do 5K races as a family. I am very slow, very, very slow. And I know for me, sometimes I don't even, like, if my husband says, okay, this for this 5K race, they have a requirement where you have to finish by a certain amount of time. I won't even run it, because I don't want to get halfway done and then you call the race. And also, in order for me to finish in that time, I'm going to be hurt. I'm going to, be winded. I'm going to be a hot mess. Everybody else, they might have ran that with ease, but I'm not going to participate if I can't run my own race. And that's what Salamander is like. You guys know, like the animal Salamander, if something grabs them by the tail, they'll just release the tail and keep running. And then they'll grow their own another tail later. That's Salamander. He don't want, if you ain't going to let him finish the race, he ain't going to start. Because he goes, why? Why should I try if you won't let me show my best? And so I couldn't have him in a traditional school environment, because they have no patience for a thinker. And I want him to think. I want him to be a thinker. I want him to keep that creativity. And so I have to constantly balance protecting my child's creativity, protecting his heart, protecting who he is, and also preparing him to be able to function in this fast-paced world. And that's why, when I was glad that my husband and our psychologist, everybody was sitting around in the room, and everybody acknowledged, you know what, this is going to be tough. Your identity, I know you were Dr. J, and you had this great, outside the home career, and everything's going good, but for the sake of your kids, gotta be home full time. I don't regret it, and I still work. I teach online, so that's I haven't left the workforce completely, but it was not, it was a lifetime. It was a long-term commitment, and so that was something that I had to realize that. And now that we're in the throes of it, I realize there's no way I'd be able to work outside the home. There's no way I'd be able to put them in a traditional school environment. And I don't regret the decision at all, but I think that sometimes people, they don't appreciate what you go through when you have gifted kids, because they just assume, ooh, gifted, like presents, like, free stuff, candy. Oh, it must be so easy for you because your kids are so smart, they're so bright, and oh, I wish that we could have that. You don't want this gift. And everybody out there with gifted kids will tell you, you don't want this gift. It is the gift that keeps on giving and keeps on, and you're giving in the process. So it's amazing to watch their minds work. It's amazing to watch them develop. It's amazing what they can do. But it's still a very tiring process. Tiring for them, tiring for you, because they're not appreciated in society, but everybody wants to use them up. Oh, wow, you invented that. Give it to us. Give it to society. Oh, wow, you can do that problem. Here, tutor these kids. Tutor those kids. So people would, if Speedster was in a traditional school setting, they'd be making him be the math tutor while they wouldn't be working on his spelling, And so, or if, Salamander was in a traditional school setting, they, put him on the robotics team and have him build all the stuff, but then they'd be like, oh, this kid's LD, And so, it's a hard balance. So that's kind of our experience. And I just wanted to put it out there to let people know that you can be intellectually gifted to a large degree, in extreme, intelligence, and have learning disabilities, and have learning struggles. And it's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with, and sometimes people are even struggling with their own children, where you go, wow, I see glimmers of greatness and glimmers of struggle, and I don't know what to trust. They can both be there. Extreme intelligence and extreme disability can coexist, and oftentimes they do. So, hope this helps. This is Dr. J, and I'm out. Bye-bye.